Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Todd Bialick, and I am the Trust and Transparency Leader for PwC. I would like to welcome everyone to our webcast today. The title of the webcast is Addressing Risks and Driving Value from Your Third-Party Contracts. We appreciate you all taking the time to join us today. Clearly, this is a hot topic for many of our clients, as we have over 1,400 folks registered for this webcast, and so clearly it's at the top of everyone's minds. We hope to spend some time today educating you on what are some of the trends in this area, what are some of the challenges that we see companies running into in the industry, and also giving you a little bit of perspective on how we've been able to help companies as they've run into some of these challenges. So first, let's talk about some of the administrative matters as we go through. So you see in front of you a slide that lists some of the details. I'm not going to cover everything, but just a couple of highlights. If you'd like to download today's presentation, go to the Resources widget at the bottom of your screen and click on there to get the slides. Another piece, if you'd like to enlarge your slides, click on the bottom right corner of the slide window and drag open to the desired size. If you have any questions along the way and you're having trouble with any of the administrative matters, just put an item in our Q&A box, and we will try and get back to you. If you're having any technical issues, just let us know and we'll try and help. On the next slide, we'll talk about CPE credit. So I know many of you are looking to get CPE credit for this. So a few things to touch upon here. If you're viewing the live webcast, you only get CPEs for the live webcast. You must remain on the webcast for the entire 60 minutes, and you must answer all 5 polling questions. You can access your CPE certificate by clicking on the CPE widget at the bottom of your screen, and that will be available at the end of the webcast. On the next slide, just to give you a brief disclaimer here, and I'll read it quick. Certain matters reviewed today may represent services that PwC may be prohibited from providing to our audit clients. In those instances, the information is being provided to inform you of options that you may want to consider as you evaluate the solution described on today's webcast. Independence rules are complex, and we recommend to discuss all the services with you in advance within the context of the independence rules. The information contained in this document is provided as is for general guidance on matters of interest only. PwC is not herein engaged in rendering legal, accounting, tax, or other professional advice and services. Before making any decision or taking any action, you should consult a competent professional advisor. We are also not providing professional advice or engaging in any professional services on this webcast. We're just trying to give you some information for you to consider. Okay, next slide has our agenda. So just to give you a sense, right? I think all companies have significant contracts with their vendors, right? And what we're seeing more and more is that companies are struggling with, one, either assessing or maintaining the value that these contracts are providing them, or managing the risks that these contracts have to them. And we're going to talk about a little bit about this as we go through each one of the slides here in this deck. So a couple things, if we go through the high-level points. Rick Gonzalez is going to touch on some of the current trends and the contract risk insights. So he's going to start at the highest level to talk about how you kind of begin a contract, what happens over time as your contract, as years and years go from the initiation and you're well within the contract, all the way to a point where you may be renegotiating contracts and what to consider. As well as kind of the different trends that we see in different industries or different types of contracts, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Ken Fakler will be talking a little bit about media and advertising contracts. So as many of you on this call, just by reading some of the companies' names, we know that you spend a lot of dollars and time with your media and advertising contracts. Well, we're seeing a trend in that area that we're trying to that we're working with clients in order to understand what is being provided by those advertising agencies, and to work with companies to make sure that they're getting what they expect to be getting out of them. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Jeff Leedom will be talking a little bit about the licensing and contract compliance business that we have, which really looks at some of the different areas. If you have software licenses, if you're a company that has software licenses, how do you know that companies are using those appropriately, as well as some other areas. And we'll talk about a little bit about the risks of those type of contracts, as well as how companies are getting comfortable that they're getting the money for the license that they're providing. And then Rick Gonzalez will also be talking about an IT outsourcing contract. So just giving you a case study as to some of the things that we've seen surrounding some of our cost side contracts and how we've worked with our clients to ensure that the vendors are doing right by them and they're getting the right value out of the contracts. And then lastly, Rich Alber will be talking about the third-party risk management process. And this is where it kind of comes above viewing a specific contract, and actually it's how do you view the program, how do you analyze what is your risk throughout the program, how do you determine what contracts you need to get into from a risk perspective to make sure that the vendors that you use are not putting you as a company at risk, and how you manage that risk. So that's kind of the agenda for today. We will have some polling questions, as we said before, and I'll flip to the first one to get us started here. And so I'll read it. How often do you monitor your third-party agreements to ensure compliance with contractual terms? Letter A, periodically. Letter B, annually. Letter C, every 3 years. Or letter D, never. While you're answering that question, and if you do have any problems, just throw us a message in the Q&A bucket, and we can help you through it. But while we're answering that, I would like to introduce our speakers for today. So I already introduced myself. This is Todd Bialick. We have Rick Gonzalez. Rick is a managing director with our commercial assurance team based in New York City. Rick has extensive experience assisting clients with contract compliance and optimization, contract and vendor management, enterprise cost reduction, media and production agency systems and processes, operational efficiencies, and client profitability. Next will be Ken Fakler, and Ken leads our media and advertising assurance services practice with 20 plus years of experience. Ken has helped many organizations reduce costs and increase transparency through provider consolidation, the implementation of compliance programs, contract compliance reviews, and media buying audits. Next is Jeff Leedom, and Jeff is a partner in our Los Angeles office that leads our licensing management and contract compliance practice. Jeff has over 20 years experience performing work in contract compliance, revenue and cost recovery, licensing, and intellectual property protection and enforcement. And then lastly, Rich Alber. Rich is a director in our vendor management, vendor risk management group, and he does performance improvement and compliance practice. He recently joined the firm with 10 years of experience in vendor and IT risk management. And so with that, we will go to the responses on the polling question. Okay, looks like we're having a little bit of technical difficulty. Oh, there we go. So it looks like almost 40% of the respondents review their contracts periodically, semi-annually or quarterly. 35% are annually. 8% are every 3 years, and there's 17% out there that don't do it at all. So with that, I'm hopeful that we're going to be able to kind of educate the folks kind of along that continuum, right? Provide some insight into the folks who do this already and ways or pitfalls that we've seen or ways that we might be able to do a little bit better. Or in other cases, in folks who don't do this at all, maybe we can give them some perspective on why companies do it and work through there. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rick Gonzalez.
Thanks, Todd. So as Todd laid out, for the next few minutes, I'll frame out our discussion and touch on the business need or the growing concern, if you will, risks and challenges, a suggested approach to address those challenges, and benefits or value drivers that can be derived from that approach. And from there, we'll take a deeper dive into some of the specific areas as Todd laid out to hopefully bring this more to life. So to start, what is the business need or the growing concern? Well, we know that over the life cycle of a contract, the value erodes. What we need and got years ago may be very different than where we are today. The actual value that's being generated from the contract can be quite different than the perceived value. And our experience in benchmarks show that this gap can often be anywhere between 5 to 15% of the annual contract value. So it can be significant, no doubt. Lack of transparency, scope creep, fragmented purchasing, change in business models are all factors that contribute to that value erosion, if you will. However, there's some overall factors that increase risks with third parties and the related contracts. Certainly some of those include the following: desire to achieve short-term, sustainable, and measurable cost savings. Whether your culture is inherently within your organization to cut or contain costs, or whether there's a cost savings initiative in place with a specific target, no doubt it's a key contributor. M&A activity, right? Since the financial crisis, we've seen an increase in M&A activity. Well, when you acquire a business, you also acquire its contracts. Whether you keep those agreements, terminate them, or consolidate them, no doubt this increases risk. Outsourcing of business processes. Well, while outsourcing undoubtedly has many benefits, it also comes with associated third-party and contract risk, no doubt. Regulatory requirements. Continued changes to regulations have increased risks. Certainly for those organizations that operate in a regulated sector, assessing third parties and contracts is another key factor overall that impacts risks associated with your third parties and contracts. And globalization and procurement of international contracts, which we see more and more of in the market. Whether it's increased scale of the contracts or extending those contracts across borders, absolutely that increases the overall risk profile. So how big is this concern? Well, recent study that was done around contract management showed that ineffective management of contracts may represent more than $150 billion of lost opportunities. So no doubt it is a significant issue out there as shown by the study. From there, the question may be, which third parties touch certain areas? Well, many areas are touched, and we refer to this interconnected network as the contract risk universe. The risk or concern is really agnostic, and I think Todd mentioned that phrase, if you will, but it really is agnostic to your industry, to the size of your company. Everyone has third-party contracts. Some companies have hundreds, but some have thousands. So the risks are spread across marketing and all of the different agency relationships, real estate, IT, even revenue side contracts such as licensing and revenue sharing through alliances and JVs. As we see here on the slide, there's many other areas of spend, many other areas of contractual relationships that in essence impact, if you will, this contract risk universe. You may ask, well, what types of contracts tend to be more susceptible to risk and value erosion? Well, there certainly are many, but just to name a few, IT and BPOs, simply because of their complexity with pricing and SLAs, service level agreements. Marketing, because no doubt of its large spend, but also because, and this is a key thing to point out, your agency is not many times the vendor or the supplier. Rather, they're a middleman acting on your behalf. The vendor or supplier ultimately can be an NBC or a CBS or a production house. So with this layer in between, obviously they're more susceptible to risk and value erosion. Capital projects, really due to their scale, the use of multiple subcontractors and change orders that no doubt are inherent within the construction of a building, for example. Licensing and royalties really are no longer just an arrangement of revenue share based on percentage of sales. Those types of arrangements have become a lot more complex, and that the more complexity leads to the more risks, leads to, in essence, the more value erosion. So how do you approach these risks and this growing concern? Well, undoubtedly there isn't a one-size-fits-all, and we're not going to sit here and say that there is a one-size-fits-all. However, a suggested approach to consider is that of a dual-sided coin. So on one side, it's about your own internal backyard, assessing the processes and controls by which you govern and manage your third parties and the related contracts. How are these contracts being monitored? Who does what, when, and how with respects to the contract? What are the gaps, if any? What are the root causes to those contracts? The other side of the coin really extends outside of your own backyard to the third party itself. Testing for contractual compliance. Did you get what you paid for? Did you receive what you were supposed to receive? And obtaining the necessary transparency that you did not otherwise have, which is a big, big value component to this. So on the back end, what are some of the benefits and some of the value drivers that can be ultimately derived from this suggested approach? Well, undoubtedly, there's potential recoveries of cost or revenue from a third party's noncompliance. There may be go-forward cost savings from process changes, restructuring of terms and KPIs. But one of the biggest value drivers is you don't know what you don't know. And now you have obtained the necessary transparency to make business decisions and or be able to use leverage to be in a more favorable position when it comes to negotiating or renegotiating terms. So those are some of the value drivers that are specific to reviewing a contract. But if you think about it, this really does extend to other areas such as spend rationalization and strategic sourcing benefits that can certainly be identified and realized across the entire portfolio, if you will, of contracts. So with that, I'll turn it to Ken, and certainly in the media industry, one of the big concerns currently is transparency, and I touched upon that being one of the big value drivers. So Ken, why don't you take everyone through, in essence, what's going on in that industry with regards to not only challenges, but some of the transparency factors.
Thank you, Rick, and I think before we begin, we have another polling question. Yes, we do. So the question is, have you ever performed a third-party contract review of your media advertising spend with your agency? Select A, yes, if done so in the last 12 months. Select B, yes, in the last 3 years. C, no, but currently evaluating the need. Or D, no, have never performed a third-party contract review of our media and advertising spend.
Hey, Ken, while we're waiting for that answer, maybe you could answer a question, right? Because there are
Sure.
a lot of folks who are sitting on the phone who say, hey, we do these all the time. Yep, this is part of our internal audit program or that kind of thing. Give me a sense as to some of the gaps you see when certain companies kind of treat this as no different than any other operational audit that they might have.
Yeah, I think that's important because this area is very specific. Obviously, there's relationships and key relationships between marketing organizations and their third-party agencies. So I think understanding that this is a strategic partner of your company is very important versus just a third-party vendor. This is a strategic partner. So I think understanding the landscape, the industry, understanding how it works, the media landscape and the advertising landscape and how agencies operate is very important so that you can minimize disruption actually on both sides, both the advertiser side and on the agency side. I think that's probably one big gap there.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. Well, hopefully you're having a chance to answer the question, and the results should be showing up shortly. 50% no, have never performed a review. And let's see, 20% are looking at it. So about 70% they're in the no and 30% have done something in this area. So advancing to the next slide, let's talk a little bit about the challenges and risks here within the media and advertising. I want to set the frame here. When we talk about media and advertising, we're talking about all forms of marketing, really. Media, both traditional as well as, of course, digital. We're talking about the production of advertising, whether that's printing, catalogs, brochures, signage, anything having to do with getting your company's name out there and your brand out there. It includes direct marketing, direct mail, public relations, sponsorships, events. All forms of marketing are part of what we define as media and advertising. And with that, there are third-party contracts potentially associated with each of these types of marketing channels, if you will. And this really cuts across most industry sectors, whether you're a financial services company, a banking, insurance, retail, consumer, telecom, entertainment, energy, pharma, the list goes on. There's monies that are being expended and there's contracts out there. And really some of the key challenges is that this can be a big spend and one that rarely gets looked at. We could see that from the answer on the poll. And you don't know what you don't know. There's been a lot of transparency issues lately. There was a report that was put out by K2 Intelligence in June, just this past June, about non-transparent business practices, where it was found that there were rebates and discounts that the agencies receive from media suppliers that may not be passed back to clients that are spending money in advertising, agency acting as principal versus agency, hidden markups and commissions. So there is non-transparent business practice out there, which makes it really important to understand your contracts, who you're working with, and really getting behind understanding to make sure that you're getting what you're paying for in your big marketing, media, and advertising spend. It can be large. This is often an area for cost reduction, savings that may result in looking at this, as well as process improvements, and of course looking at the controls behind this big spending area. There's a lot of choices out there, digital marketing channels, wide spectrum of media outlets. It's making it more complicated to ensure that you're getting what you're paying for. So it's important for many companies that are looking at this to make sure they're getting what they're paying for, that the quality of the media, that they're in the right programs, in the right media, and that they're hitting their target audience and the customers that they want to reach. It's very important. As I mentioned before, media discounts, rebates, credits that could be owed. So there's really a component to this of cost savings when you're doing this type of contract review in the media and advertising area. Just want to walk quickly through a case study on the next slide. And this is a real-life situation. This happened to be a retail consumer organization that looked at their creative production agency. This is an agency that did creative work around printed materials and even broadcast, radio, television, that type of advertising. They had never performed a review. They spend over $40 million annually in this area. And their objective was to do basic agency compliance with the agreement. They wanted to focus on the fees they were paying their agency, all the production pass-through charges, and making sure that they were adhering to industry-leading practices, and of course, cost savings opportunities and process improvements that may result from this. So the work it did involve looking, at creative production practices and controls, the management over that, the accuracy and propriety of the creative production billings and related payments, looking at agency fees, looking at travel, looking at proof of performance. Did the ad run? Did it hit the target? Was it billed properly? Those types of things. And in this specific case, as soon as this third-party agency was notified, there were credits that were there that the agency passed immediately back to this client upon notification, and often that can be the case. There were also examples of double billing, where the labor of the agency personnel was billed twice, once as part of the fee and once as an out-of-pocket pass-through cost, and there was prepayment involved, about $1 million of cash flow inefficiency that the third-party agency billed in advance to the client, which obviously caused a strain on cash flow. And there were billing rates that were in the contract that were not adhered to or pre-approved for many of the fees that were passed through. So in this specific example, there were definitely cost-saving opportunities, but even more importantly, that there were better contract terms that were able to get leveraged going forward into the future for this specific case. So that's just one example. Obviously, there's several others across all the spectrum of marketing that I discussed before, including media, direct marketing, direct mail, and all of that. This happened to be a creative production agency. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Jeff, who will discuss licensing, which is a very related area.
Hey, Ken.
And Jeff, yep. Mm-hmm.
One thing before we move on, just to kind of go back to the media and advertising, is there's a language used in the media and advertising space that is different than a lot of the other spaces. So it is a land of its own. Where we've done work for different clients, what we found is even when a company has teams doing their audits and going through this, the folks who are doing it kind of touch it at a very high level as opposed to getting into the details that they need to get into to understand the real value that the company's getting. So I wanted to frame that. And with that, we can go to Jeff.
All right. Thanks a lot, guys. Before we get into IP licensing related arrangements, I did want to mention that IP licensing is just one example of a revenue-based agreement that can pose not only extensive risk but also what I would call opportunity for revenue recovery. So I think Todd mentioned at the top of the call that there's a whole host of revenue-related contracts, those that we work with our clients to identify risk, and as I said, more importantly, mitigate that risk and realize revenue recovery. That may include contracts that involve joint ventures, even general revenue share, franchise agreements, and even distribution agreements. So there's a whole host of revenue side agreements. Again, just as an example, we've picked IP licensing to walk through. And you can see on this slide, it is a significant issue. We've performed thousands and thousands of these reviews. And in that data, what we've found is that just about 88% of those reviews have yielded significant revenue recovery or financial findings. So it is a real common issue across not only IP licensing, but other revenue-related contracts. And really the biggest question that typically comes from our clients to begin with is, why is there such a challenge with this type of contract? And I think it's been mentioned in this discussion before, but the fact is that most of our clients don't have the level of transparency that they need to ensure that their business partners are complying with those terms and conditions of each of these specific agreements. In the IP licensing space, this tends to sit in the space of what is the royalty base. Many of these contracts are gross sales related as a royalty base, and there's a lot that goes into how do their licensees get from gross to net sales, what are allowable deductions, are sales reported completely, accurately. There's just a whole host of questions that typically information provided to our clients isn't enough to close the gap. I would say that the second leading cause of challenge in these type of contracts is also ambiguity with contract language. The problem here is that these companies have contracted typically early on in a relationship that contract and the terms around that contract have not been operationalized from a business perspective with, in this case, let's call it a licensee. So once a licensee operationalizes their business, starts utilizing the IP, manufacturers maybe sells product related to that IP use, then is when reporting happens, and they can then try to utilize that contract then to try to report accurately, which in some cases, because they couldn't foresee maybe some business issues with the licensee, there becomes very generic, ambiguous terms, and applicability of those terms becomes a concern. So contract language, ambiguity in that language, and some of the contract interpretation issues become a significant challenge. The underlying risk that results from these challenges, it may seem obvious, but most of our clients are obviously concerned with revenue leakage. Are we being paid royalties accurately? Are we basically generating the value, as Rick indicated early on? Are we still generating the value out of these contracts that we thought we would when we signed the contracts with these licensees? And so, there's a whole host of reasons why, as I've indicated, licensees have a challenge in terms of their reporting. Sometimes it's just sheer lack of controls. A lot of licensees don't spend a lot of time, effort, manpower, and resources around setting up controls to report royalties accurately or to report general revenue share and other items and other revenue-related contracts. There's also, data analytic issues, IT issues that, analysts that are responsible for reporting don't have good data. And then finally, I would say that, in some instances, not a lot, but in some instances, we even, come across some fraudulent activity as well. And that obviously can be very concerning for our business partners. So maybe to bring this to life, what I'd like to do is to walk through a case study. And this is a real live example of really how these issues played out with a recent project that we had with a client. This was a technology company interested in launching a licensing program. They'd never performed any type of compliance activity, whether or not it was extensive internal monitoring or if it was actually going out and performing third-party examinations or audits, even though this is the company that generated in excess of $120 million in royalty revenue stream annually. So for them, really the key objectives were not only a revenue play, right? This wasn't only, are we observing revenue leakage, but this was also an interest in, let's protect my licensing base. I want to make sure that my licensees are using the approved customers. They're also using approved IP and the approved suppliers of integrated circuits. In this case, a technology company that was licensing IP to a licensee that manufactured and sold consumer electronics. So the ICs were effectively the component that had the embedded technology or IP in it and was very important in terms of the ability for our client to be able to monitor ultimately those ICs being sold and be able to get a comfort level around then what should then I expect to be reported from a royalty perspective for those companies and my licensees that are buying the ICs, utilizing that IP. So really after spending quite a bit of time with the licensee to understand their controls, their systems, their processes, we were able to extract a very large data set of their sales transactions to start with. Ultimately, our goal was to recalculate royalties, compare that data set, and making sure that that data set, first of all, was complete. So making sure that we were able to really do a verification process to either a third-party audited financial statement, other ways to assess and make sure that completeness was there. But ultimately what we found was that in addition to the sales, because the IC portion of this was so important, we got into, and ultimately that's where the IP sat, we got into really understanding where did this licensee use the ICs. So we spoke to and had a lot of conversations with their development teams, their manufacturing folks to understand ultimately, look, licensee, can you pull for us where used reports and help us understand where in the manufacturing process you use the IC and what products utilize that IC, thus to triangulate and ultimately have another way for us to identify potential use of the IP. In addition to that, we also looked at and analyzed deductible transactions, as I spoke about at the top of this presentation. This was a case of a royalty base that was net sales based. So deductible items were very important, a big part of the assessment. And what we found was, look, this licensee were using estimates. They were using estimates to gauge what ultimately they could use as deductions. There weren't actual costs that were used, as well as there were some deductions that were ultimately not contractual. So those were two big issues that came out of some of the findings from some of the testing and analysis. But overall, what was the underlying value? Obviously, most of our clients are worried about revenue leakage. In this specific case, there was about $1.2 million, $1.3 million in royalties that were understated. In that case, there was an extensive conversation and talk about not only what came from that and what were the key reasons, but also what was the underlying gaps in processes, controls, because what we wanted to do is not only help our clients extract revenue out of this process and close the gaps from a revenue leakage perspective, but also look at it as, look, we need to mitigate this risk going forward. And so it was really, when you came down to it, it was a win-win for our clients as well as the licensee, because in this case, the licensee, they were the company that wanted to do the right thing. They wanted to report accurately. They didn't have the controls to do it. We identified some gaps, and they were able to close some of those controls. So they came away from it happy that they could basically feel like they didn't have the liability that they did here in the past. There were a couple of other items that were also important that came out that our clients were excited that they were able to close some of these risks. We identified some gray market sales. In this case, there were sales that were made into the gray market. Our client was very concerned about protecting that channel. And so we were able to gather some sales data as well as some market intelligence to identify some of that activity, and we were able to mitigate some of that. And then finally, there was also some advertising-related requirements. The licensee was required to spend advertising. They fell short. They were able to mitigate that in the following year, and it was just another area that was successful in this engagement. So overall, I think it yielded great qualitative and quantitative value. Both licensee, licensor saw value in the process, and overall risk could be mitigated. So with that, I think we can go to our next polling question, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, so maybe if I could, why don't we broaden the question a bit? So instead of just licensing compliance controls here, if the audience can think about this in terms of broader revenue-related contract compliance controls that your organization may have in place. So the answers to that would be A, either your organization has a mature program that involves both internal analytics and monitoring as well as performance of third-party audits, or maybe it's a developing program. Maybe it's limited internal monitoring, analytics, or external third-party audit work. And in many cases, we find that maybe programs haven't yet been established. And then there's always companies out there that they have transparency into their revenue streams, their revenue-related contracts, and maybe the program just isn't applicable. So with that, we'll give you guys some time to answer the polling question.
Hey, Jeff, maybe a question that the audience posed while we're waiting for the answers to come back. So yeah. I think there seems to be a common theme where companies become concerned when they do this type of work, reviewing the contracts, that it's going to have negatively impact the relationship that they have with the other party. Give me your perspective on that.
Yeah, it's a very common question. Before we start a program with a client, all of our clients are asking, how does this impact our relationships? Obviously, this in some cases is the lifeblood of our business. We need to protect those relationships. And I would say this, is that especially given our approach, we want to develop that relationship with the licensee because we want to, as I stated in the middle of my presentation, we want to build that transparency. We want to build that trust. And the only way that we can do that is first to build the trust with us, right? That's the only way that they're going to ultimately provide us with the right information. I would say this, really the only time that we run into relationship-related issues is that when a licensee or a business partner is committing some type of fraudulent activity or intentionally trying to basically hide information, right, and intentionally misreporting to our clients. So in those cases, our clients, quite frankly, are happy to know who they're doing business with, right? And it becomes a relationship issue that they need to manage for more than just they're not necessarily happy about questions or information that we're asking about, but they have deeper issues to deal with. So I would say, in short, it's really 99% of the time it's not an issue at all. In fact, it enhances the relationship. And in those that it is, I think our clients are very happy to know what they're dealing with. So.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Do we have okay, so the answers looks like quite a few folks are either developing a program or have a pretty robust program in place, but there's a whole host, at least half or more, that currently don't have a program or not applicable. So good to hear that there's quite a few folks that are looking at this and also observe some of the risks and opportunities that exist with this type of program. So with that, I know that Rick, I think I'm going to turn it back to you. You mentioned IT spend, and I know that that's a big area of concern for our clients. I'd love you to get a little bit more detail around what that means in terms of challenges and risks and what you've seen in this space.
Sure thing. So as we mentioned at the outset, IT and the related spend and contracts no doubt play a significant role in opportunities and risks, but also in that value erosion concept that we introduced. And, some of the challenges, and really the big one is keeping up, right? IoT, Internet of Things, seems to be the latest topic, and yesterday was cloud computing, and cybersecurity, in essence, continues to be a challenge for many, and the rapidly changing world that we live in technology and keeping up is probably the biggest challenge. That ultimately results in a lot of products and services being highly specialized, and when you need that specialization, now you're undoubtedly beginning to increase the suppliers and the service providers that you work with. And the more contracts you have, obviously there's an increase in risk from that perspective, right? In the IT space, another big challenge that we see is heavy reliance on your third parties. These are the subject matter experts. These are the areas of specialization, if you will. And because of that, many contracts are difficult to monitor. They're poorly written, they're ambiguous, etc. Some of the risks are really around complex pricing and charging mechanisms, tiered pricing and pricing by category, and it's just a huge level of complexity with IT arrangements. SLA, service level agreements, and KPIs are something that's extremely prevalent in the IT space, yet we find that some of them are poorly written. They're not necessarily monitored or monitored on a frequent basis, and certainly there's non-compliance issues that undoubtedly come up. Right? So from there, I'll share quickly a case study with you on a recent engagement that we worked on with a client, and this client had a 5-year agreement with their IT BPO, and the agreement was coming upon expiration in early 2017, and the CIO simply wanted to pause, take a step back, and review the contract not only from a management and governance perspective internally, but also going out to the third party and making sure that they're being billed correctly, making sure that they're getting what they're paying for, making sure that they have all of the transparency, which continues to be a key theme here, right? Needed to be in an optimal position to make decisions as to whether to continue with the provider or at the end of the day move away and solicit bids, right? So the approach that was taken was very much similar to the one that we laid out at the outset with that dual-sided coin. Look inwardly at a governance and management processes and controls, but then look outwardly at the third party to validate billings of IT services, core and non-core, the contract at specific CPI price increases embedded in the agreement, and the ever-popular most favored nations provisions that many times are existent in these particular contracts, as well as large BPO contracts that really are a challenge to get reporting and transparency on. From the work that was performed, there was undoubtedly a bunch, over 20 improvement opportunities that were ultimately recommended in areas such as asset management and improvements on hardware purchases, to scope of work development, to streamlining invoicing, all in the spirit of ultimately working better together, either with that particular service provider or lessons learned that they can take to a different service provider. Governance model had to be further enhanced and developed to more clearly monitor SLAs and KPIs. From a quantitative standpoint, there was a significant amount of monies that can be saved going forward, over $3 million. And that really had to do with the concept, again, of transparency that the client did not have. But once they began to really understand spend, scale, potential rebates that may be available to them, renegotiating points, there was no doubt levers that can be pulled for them to save money going forward. And then as many cases when you review some of these contracts, and and this one was about $30 million on an annual basis, there's things that fall through the cracks, right? And Jeff kind of laid out some of these recovery opportunities, if you will. In this case, the client was able to recover over $1 million due to some non-compliance issues with CPI increases. So IT, big area of complexity, big area of opportunity, but the corresponding risk. So up till now, we really took a deep dive into really 3 specific areas, if you will, of contracts. But the overarching umbrella is really third-party risk management, if you will. And with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Rich Albert, for him to go through that overarching umbrella of managing risk across your entire enterprise, across your entire portfolio of third parties.
Thank you for that introduction, Rick. And, as Rick mentioned, the enterprise third-party risk management view is very important because, in addition to managing contract risks, there's many other aspects of third-party risk that will help drive the contractual development process. In particular, things like security and business continuity terms and conditions, incentivizing the contracts, things like that are very important to understand from a totality of concept. And the other reason is simply, and this goes back to the old adage many of you may have heard, you can outsource the risk or the service, but you can't outsource the risk. So it's important to understand that you have a program and how to deal with that. So I'd like to talk first about some common challenges within third-party risk. One of the biggest ones we see is really around defining what third parties are within an organization. Many times an organization and the individuals within it think of the word vendor and supplier, and it kind of puts a specific image in their minds of who they're dealing with and what the relationship is. But as you've heard on this webcast today, there's many other relationships that could pose significant risk to an organization, things like joint ventures, co-business relationships, affiliate arrangements, all have some type of typically a contractual arrangement with them. And many times the company just doesn't really understand that. So it's important for leadership in an organization to kind of come together and discuss exactly what would be in the scope of one of these programs. Inventory is another one. It's very difficult to manage contractual risk and risks of third parties if you don't know who you're doing business with. Many times companies have a list of contracts, but it's incomplete, or it's in many different source systems or even physical locations. So it's important to take a look at things like the spend in an organization, maybe from accounts payable perspective, to identify your inventory, and even ask the business if things are missing as well to make sure you're working with a complete starting point. Risk assessment is another common challenge point. What are the vendors doing for you? And more importantly, how are they doing this? How is the service being provided? We come across time and time again that companies do not fully understand this, and what that does is they fail to implement the right mitigating activities, or the contracts aren't constructed properly to help mitigate risk through the contractual mechanisms. An example of this many times is around, does the contract incentivize a vendor to take undue risks for you? For those of you who are familiar in the banking space, collection agents as a third party is a great example. Typically they're paid via the contract based on how much they collect. Do they have the ability to say things that they shouldn't be saying, call it inappropriate times in order to collect more funding. So, and by doing that, they might be in violation of law. Another area is around control reviews. The biggest question we get here is, how much do I need to do? When's enough's enough with a control review? Do I have to send questionnaires to all my vendors? Do I need to? Can I just look at what we call SSA 16 reporting, SOC reporting? Is that sufficient enough? Can I rely on other mechanisms to get comfortable around the controls? And then when the information comes back, is it actually being fed into a sourcing and procurement function to help them understand what are the right T's and C's to go into the contracts, and potentially even help negotiate better pricing terms because there's issues? There's a whole other host of common challenges here, so I'd like to cover maybe real quick the tools and technology one and cover some of the other ones as we go to the other slides. But many times these programs are super manually intensive. There's a host of tools and technology that people struggle to understand and how it can help them. There are GRC tools, there's third-party risk management tools, there's sourcing tools, and then there's just other tools that exist out there. I think the important thing for you to understand is what is it exactly you want the tool to do, because there's no one of these tools that I would call a silver bullet to solve all your third-party risk management problems. They need to work together in what I would call an ecosystem of risk management around third parties. That's a big challenge. So taking the time to fully understand your requirement before you engage with one of them will help you tremendously. And with that, I'd like to kind of go on to the next topic, which is really around key drivers. So this is really to help, especially those of you who don't have a program or are thinking about it, what's pushing companies to do this. So there's really two main things that I would say that make companies develop third-party risk management programs. The first one is typically if you're in a regulated environment, your regulator tells you have to have a program. That one's an easier one to make a business case for. The second one, which is the one that unfortunately creates most programs, is there's finally some type of incident that happens. There's a security breach, there's a significant outage, and everyone looks to the sourcing individuals in the first line in the business to say, how come nobody knew about this? Why didn't we do the right due diligence? So I think it's very important when you're thinking about this to have that conversation with executive management to talk through just how much risk are they willing to take. Are they willing to have a lack of transparency and gamble that one of these events may happen to you? That's why programs get created, and it's very important to have that conversation, which kind of transitions into the next slide around really what are the benefits of a program. So many of the benefits, are very understandable. There's a reduction in cost potentially. The increase in transparency, I think, is first and foremost. But one of them, though, that I think really that's probably one of the things that doesn't get discussed enough is this improving your shareholder value, being able to talk through and build the reputation of your organization from having a good program. Many of people who you provide services to look at you as a third party, and if they don't think your environment's controlled very well or you're controlling your own vendors very well, it could damage your reputation. So there's some level of reputational risk that needs to be managed with that, and that can be done through the contractual process as well. And then finally, I think I'd like to just maybe highlight a couple hot topics that have been out in the industry recently. So one of the bigger ones, and I think this is applicable to any organization, whether you have a program or you don't even have it, is there's a high likelihood that there's some concentration risk that may exist within the vendor population that you're using. Do you have visibility into how much of a critical process has actually been outsourced to a vendor? Do you have visibility into where these vendors are doing the business from, and is there a geographical risk now that's been created? Is there a risk of that these vendors are all using a common subcontractor? The term we use many times is fourth party in the industry. You might have spread your contracts to many different vendors, but they all use a common fourth party to perform a significant aspect of what they do on your behalf, and does that create risk? And then finally, there's what we call reverse concentration risk, which is really around, is there you as a entity for that as a customer, are you too much of their revenue, or is there another company that's too much of their revenue, and what impact that may have to you? That's probably the hottest topic right now. There's many others. Cybersecurity is certainly another large one that's out there as well. I can talk to that maybe during the question. So maybe I think now it's time for the polling question. So we can move to that. Looks like we're having a little technical difficulty. All right, here we go. So the fourth polling question is, does your company currently have a third-party risk management function or program? The answers are yes, no, but we are currently exploring a program. No, but we are currently in the process of implementing one. No, we do not have any kind of third-party risk management function or program.
And Rich, while we're waiting for the answers, maybe I can throw out something out there. One of the things that I've seen, and I'm sure you'll agree, is if you look at companies who are trying to address third-party risk, whether it's cyber or data privacy or any other risk that they're trying to identify, if you don't have a more sophisticated third-party risk management program, my sense is it's like the peanut butter approach, right? You're gonna spread it along, across 100 contracts as opposed to focusing on the contracts that really matter to your business. Is that kind of what you see companies that are struggling with this?
Yeah, typically what we see at companies who really don't have any formalized process around this is a very one-size-fits-all approach or no approach at all. I think what we would recommend is that it's a risk-based approach. And in order to get to a risk-based approach, there's some very fundamental things that a company needs to understand. One is, who do I do, or who have I contracted with? What's my inventory? Two, have I done a risk assessment of what they do for me? And that's typically done, through a set of questions and discussion among people competent enough and understanding how the services are provided. And then third, most companies will then look at, how do I mitigate that? And that could be we actually look for controls. It could be we accept the risk, or other options as well. And then finally, if there's a problem, how do we handle that problem? If a company who's at the very beginning of this can get their hands around those four things and make it consistent enough that it's done across an organization, they'll be very far ahead of probably most of their peers are, and able to manage and mitigate and report even on the third parties they use. And with that, we have our polling results. So 42% of companies actually have a third-party risk management program. And then it looks like about just over 20% are currently in the process of exploring it or implementing one. And then about 34% don't have anything at this time. So with that, Todd, I will hand it back to you for closing remarks.
Let me take it back, and we'll go to the last polling question just to make sure we get that in. And while we're doing that, I'll let you look at that on the screen as we flip to it, and I'll get to some of the key takeaways here. So to me, the first thing is we all have really important contracts to our companies, right? We need to make sure that we analyze those contracts to make sure we're getting the value out of them, and to make sure we're managing the risk to our company with these relationships, right? And we've talked about a handful of different varieties of contracts where we've seen different areas. But to me, this is any contract you have. And so obviously we've seen through some of the answers to the questions, there's a lot of different companies. There's a lot of different companies that might not do any of this work today. So my recommendation to those companies is not anything to do with PwC, but it's more of you likely need to do something within your company to get comfortable that you're getting the value and managing the risk, whether that's bringing in folks from your internal audit group, bringing in others from the company who might have the right level of expertise, and or bringing it in a third party to help you with this. But you need the right folks to analyze those contracts to make sure you're really managing the risk, and that you're getting the right value from this. And it really is as a three-part process, as Rick had mentioned. It is looking at what is going on at your company to manage a contract and getting the right aspects, what's going on, are you getting the right value out of it, and then is the third party complying what they're supposed to be complying with. And if you kind of pull all those together for the contracts that you believe are most important to your company, then you're getting to the right level. So with that, we are at exactly 3 o'clock Eastern. I want to thank everyone for joining. We appreciate you taking the time today. And feel free to answer the question, and we'll provide those results to you. If you have any questions, feel free to get to any of us with any follow-ups. Thank you very much for your time today.